Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm your host, Sher Ali Khan. Today's guest is Arlen Austin, editor, translator, and theorist, whose work engages the militant feminist current of Lotta Femminista. Arlen has worked closely with Mariarosa Dalla Costa, Leopoldina Fortunati, and Silvia Federici. He is currently translating Fortunati's landmark text, The Arcana of Reproduction, for Verso Books, continues to collaborate with both Dalla Costa and Federici on publishing and archival projects. This conversation explores the political and theoretical interventions of Lotta Femminista, centering their challenge to Marxist orthodoxy on value, the wage, and reproductive labor. We talk about surplus, accumulation, cybernetics, enclosure, care, algorithmic command, and the stakes of editing militant theory today. Like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to support the work, visit buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Hey, Arlen, how are you doing?
Hey, good. It's great to see you. And everyone, please buy Sherritt coffee. He's done great work for a long time now. This sort of interviewing and culture of conversation on the left is very important.
It's great to have you here. You've collaborated closely with Dalla Costa, Fortunati, and Federici across archives, translation, and editorial work. How did you first get involved with their thinking and organizing, and what drew you to spend so much time inside this political lineage?
Well, it's a great question, and in some ways it was just simply rather fortuitous that I fell into working so intensively in these archives. I had graduated, I had studied art history and visual arts, and worked in all sorts of cultural industries. I was a printmaker, assistant, fabricator, all sorts of the ways in which, a young precarious workforce tries to make a living in New York City. So I'd gone to school there. And, after graduation in the wake of the financial crisis, I think became increasingly involved in workplace organizing groups and the questions of solidarity and its possibility and its futures, what the Apparisti would call co-research at class composition between different groups that were organizing in New York. And I actually started, working with some wonderful groups that, looking back, were fairly traditional. I mean, some of them were more traditional kind of nonprofit style workplace justice groups, community organizations. Some were more militant, claims for class cross industry solidarity and radical action. But all of them were sort of swept up in Occupy. And at the same time, I was beginning to do more archival research just into histories of movements. It wasn't, I'd studied, I'd taken classes in Marxism and labor history, and I was familiar with the leftist traditions in the visual arts from studies of post-war art history. But my knowledge was fairly superficial, and I started doing more and more archival research. And believe it or not, I was working in the archives of the Lesbian Her Story Archive, which is one of these incredible collections in Brooklyn, in a brownstone in Brooklyn that Joan Nessel was one of the co-founders, Deb Eilers. They have a wonderful culture of folks, queer and lesbian folks who were involved in a kind of earlier generation of organizing, who have really preserved that collection. And I think I asked them at one point if they had anything from welfare rights movements and wages for housework. And I'm going to get her name right. Saskia, I think it was, brought out a box or brought me to a closet upstairs that had boxes of materials, that weren't in the normal files. And I started going through those, and there was this abundance, like an entire archival history was just sort of sitting there of the New York Wages for Housework group, Black Women for Wages for Housework, some of the London groups, Wages to Lesbians in Toronto, and some of the Italian materials as well. And at the same time, I think it was as Occupy was getting started, you'd go to these meetings. I mean, before I even knew who they were, I think I noticed that there was a somewhat older couple, who were brilliant and patient and knowledgeable, and who people often sort of looked to with historical and political questions. And it turned out they were George Cofensis and Silvia Federici, because they, of course, were very, very involved in that scene. And then at some point, through mutual friends, I was very involved in the arts and labor group, and there were many folks there who were working to foreground those traditions at the time, and I just ended up emailing Silvia and saying, "Hey, can you come take a look at this collection at the Lesbian Her Story Archives?" And she did. And at the time, she had been wanting for the longest time, I think, to make an archival history of the New York group. And of course, I said, "Sure, I will, gladly help you with that." And the first collection was sort of put together. The first book I worked on with her was put together with her own collection, some materials from the Lesbian Her Story Archive, and then a few other scattered archives that we were able to draw from, but focused fairly specifically in the New York group, between in the early periods of its development and political work, right, from about 72 to 77, 78. Subsequently, as I became more and more engaged in media questions of media production, militancy, let's say media archives, relations between media and politics, and went on to do PhD work, she I think introduced me to Mariarosa Dalla Costa, who is, of course, in Padova. And because I was able to get fellowships, I was funded for a time, I took advantage of those to go and work closely with Mariarosa and her partner Dario, and scan that entire collection. I mean, I made multiple trips, and so it was over a number of months. And there were folks who really helped out. The whole staff of the library helped. Mariarosa's partner, Dario, was essential. And, I scanned that archive. And now, fortunately, what that also meant was being hosted by Mariarosa and Dario and introduced to their friends and a whole circle of folks in Padova, living memory of the movement, and young scholars who were working on these histories, some of whom or all of whom have gone on to do really important work. So I was able to start, more of a series of interviews and develop an even broader archive there. Yeah, and that's when I met Leopoldina, and talked about how much of her work hadn't been translated, or had been translated very, very urgently, and not revisited, as was the case with, I think, L'Arcana della Reproduction, which was released by Autonomia Media in the 90s and in a abridged version, and it was a very urgent, kind of movement text that was translated, but had been kind of re-released with reflection, historical context, etc. So we embarked on that project, and I've continued to work on translations with her. I should say, so when we say Lotta Femminista, we're referring to, right, the group, one group that forms in the Mestre area around 1971, that then becomes part of the broader wages for housework movement. But there are multiple Lotta Feminista groups. Lotta Feminista simply means feminist struggle, and it's a sort of feminist détournement or appropriation of the everything was Lotta. I mean, there was Lotta Continua, there's Lotta Armata, there's Lotta just means struggle,
Yeah.
right? So and not all of the Lotta Feminista groups identify with the claim or wages for housework. So there are groups in multiple cities. Some take up the claim, some don't. Some work with the international network and movement of wages for housework, and some do not. And then also just that everyone from that movement, went on to have, long and really rich activist careers. And so to this day, like if you go to Global Women's Strike, that's an archive of a movement that continued in London and Philadelphia and continues to do really important work. So you can find multiple legacies and continuations. What I've worked most on, just based where I was situated in the archives I studied was this earlier period, and then its ramifications in media studies and in some movements today. But of course, I think the network and archive of movements is always expanding and web-like. Sometimes when we name something a thing, there's a tendency to artificially limit it. I remember I'm translating this wonderful work right now that was one of the last journals that Lotta Feminista published, and hopefully Minor Compositions will publish this with some introductory materials. There was a fairly harsh critique of some of the groups of autonomia and the armed struggle groups of the time for kind of retrenching to a Leninist, a certain kind of Leninist ideology, a hierarchy in the late 70s when faced with crisis of the crackdown and capitalist flight. But Silvia said this funny thing. She was like, "Oh yes, we hear that that we're very hard on the Brigate Rosse, but we heard a couple months later that the women in the Brigate Rosse all had a reading group where they read our journal and they discussed it and they liked it very much." I get the sense that there was, and she said, there were some people who were in 4 or 5 groups, right? So you might be in Lotta Feminista. You might also be doing radical radio with Radio Sherwood. You might also still be in a Potera Parayo group, and you might also go to meetings for your local union, even if you thought its system was corrupt, right? So I mean, like there is today, there's a kind of fluidity and interpenetration of groups. It's maybe not always apparent, and the critiques, there's a intensive culture of critique. I think they often are quite protective of the comrades when the going gets really rough, like when they're all in prison and everyone does prison support. For example, Fortunati can be quite critical of Negri, but then she exchanges postcards with him in jail and works and is doing prison support. Silvia, same way, she's running co-running an international network of support for folks who are imprisoned through Kari with her partner George and many other intellectuals, public intellectuals. But there's an intensive culture of critique that can be quite fascinating to explore. It's certainly a contentious left, as as much as it ever has been and will be.
And I think the thing about Lotta Feminista, if we approach it as a movement, not, it emerged in tension with some of the failures of the Italian Communist Party at that
Indeed.
time and the post-workerist tendencies. What made their focus on unwaged domestic labor such a political rupture in that moment?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And you're bringing me back to something that I should have said when I was first describing Lotta Feminista, right? Sometimes I feel like I know too much about the archive, and therefore it's easy for me just to talk about it, assuming a shared knowledge which isn't necessarily there. But you're absolutely right. So, the other thing you have to remember is that many of the women, indeed, a lot of the women in Lotta Feminista were involved in Potera Parayo in the Triveneto region of northeast Italy, right, which comes out of a fairly intensive dissatisfaction with the PCI, the Italian Communist Party, and the Socialist Party, and the traditional unions or the existing unions throughout the early 60s. And a lot of that actually built from the fact, I mean, this is just to sort of generalize and give a very broad view, but that the Communist Party was sort of abandoning the new worker, right, which was of the industrial north, in the huge industrial centers of Milan and Turin, and then the new petrochemical factories, which were growing up in Mestre, right outside of Venice, some of which manufactured American munitions, right? Become, an early manufacturing center for the war economy, where Dalla Costa really sort of cut her teeth as a radical sociologist doing research into the homes there. The but there's a way in which I think the Communist Party didn't like this new worker, because they were not the old labor aristocracy. They weren't the old craft union member who really identified as a worker. They were displaced Southerners, often highly racialized within the Italian context. They were often immigrant workers from Algiers, Tunisia, Turkey. They weren't there was both a kind of racism against them, which was attended by this idea that they were not proud to be workers, not the old, like, obedient industrial worker, contracts, be loyal to a party hierarchy, be loyal to a union hierarchy, that they indeed wanted too much. They were relatively unskilled because of technological advancement. I mean, I put unskilled in quotation marks, and that's important because part of what Lotta Feminista points out is that even very simple and quote unquote unskilled labor requires this huge labor of reproduction, right? And a certain orthodox Marxist tradition wasn't very good at recognizing that even simple abstract labor is not so simple, right? It involves, a huge amount of conditioning for which this Fordist family form becomes responsible, particularly the mother as its kind of nerve center, as Fortunati claims it, right? So there's already this rejection of the, of PCI and the PSI, the Socialist Party, and some of the union forms amongst the apparisti. And you get the great journals, Quaderni Rossi, and then Classe Operaia. And then, I mean, you could call Lotta Femminista something of the revolution within the revolution. So it's both a critique of their analysis for ignoring the way that this displaced Southern and Mediterranean or formerly agricultural workers, rely on the reproduction of the family form and women's unwaged labor. And it's just a rejection. I mean, you also just have to remember sheer misogyny within leftist groups, right? And unfortunately is quite consistent in much of the new left. In the U.S. and throughout Europe, and elsewhere as well. A lot of the necessity for the formation of groups like Lotta Feminista um, was both an analytic and theoretical break, but also simply the sheer inability to work under conditions of, at times very extreme misogyny and hierarchy, right? Even in groups that were avowedly trying to break down such hierarchies.
Dalla Costa and Fortunati
And
were,
media.
I was just going to add, Dalla Costa and Fortunati were a part of Lotta Feminista, while Federici wasn't a member but shared its orientation.
Mm-hmm,
What distinct
mm-hmm,
political or theoretical contributions did each make to the critique of reproduction in class?
mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, because later on, I think, as their works develop, you can see them taking somewhat different courses, and their contributions, maybe the distinction of their contributions becomes clearer. To summarize that in a fairly reductive way, in a fairly strict disciplinary fashion, Mariarosa becomes far more involved in questions of ecology, ecofeminism, right? Actually, works, closely with Maria Ramis and Vandana Shiva, and does research into Southeast Asia, fishing communities, and fishing economies. And Fortunati goes into media studies, specifically looking at gendered uses of technology. Federici, of course, becomes very well known for historical work, right? For Caliban and the Witch and subsequent studies of the witch hunt. And that's like that's moving forward. I don't know that the seeds of those kind of differences are quite distinguishable in the early work, right? Obviously, because it is a very collaborative. Obviously they do bring, different skill sets, and they're also slightly different ages, right? Fortunati is sort of a generation young, or almost a generation younger than Mariarosa, was one of Mariarosa's students. Mariarosa was one of the first women to teach in the political science department of the University of Padua, and to engage in a really radical, sort of sociological practice that actually studied the conditions of domestic work. She'd go out early in the morning to these petrochemical factories in the Mestre area, or to the households of women whose husbands were working in the petrochemical factories, and ask about how they felt about, working all day and not having a pension, or how they felt about what their sex lives and expectations were, whether how they related to their domestic work. So really, for the time, just incredibly radical work. And Fortunati was one of her students who begins to collaborate with her on very important work. One of the still untranslated works that they write together, which actually I've almost finished translating. It was this pamphlet called Bruto Ciao, where one essay is written by Mariarosa, Reproduction and Immigration, which has been translated, which was actually initially presented as a paper at a conference on the operaio sociale, on the the social worker is actually a terrible translation of it, because it sounds like a social worker, right? Which is not what it means. It should probably stay in the Italian, but she wrote this essay about reproductive labor and immigrant workforces, right? That was really crucial for its time, that's presented here. And then it's combined with Fortunati's essay um, about a history of women's refusal in the post-war era, and how to kind of read that in an archive that renders it invisible. So it's one of these fabulous, it's kind of a proto critical fabulation, right? The way you would think of that as a very popular term in contemporary history writing, where analyzing something political and proto or political phenomena of resistance and refusal, of the family form, of compulsory motherhood, of unwaged domestic labor, but an era before it would have been clearly articulated as such in a through an organizational form, or even through a discursive form, right? And she looks at all these great pamphlets, these early pamphlets of when they're trying to reinforce discipline after the war on the union members, which basically make this argument quite clearly that the male worker, must submit to the justified brutality of the boss on the assembly line, but he gets his when he goes home, right? I mean, that the social relation is mirrored, and he becomes the boss of his own household.
I think this year you released the translation of Fortunati's Arcane of Reproduction. And
Yes, yes.
she argues in that book that reproductive labor produces surplus value, which is a break with Marxist or orthodoxy. Her analysis turns on valorization, mediation through the male wage, and command within the domestic sphere. What is at stake politically in her insistence on direct productivity of reproductive labor?
That's a great question. I think there's actually a very complicated answer, in part because I think so much gets made of this debate, right, as to whether or not reproductive work, domestic reproductive, if you want to call it labor, in the sense that it could be thought of as abstract and socially necessary, right? Whether this is productive of surplus value or not. And there's a whole back and forth, sometimes between I think between folks who are following Lise Fogel and this earlier, the sort of domestic labor debates in an Anglo-American context, and the Italian claims, and then as this plays itself out. And people still kind of rehash the debate, often fairly inaccurately, in my opinion, but you can't expect academics to be accurate. The history, I mean, I say this, I stand guilty as well. I'm not saying this to like accuse one side or the other, right? I mean, people are often quite partisan, consciously or not, in their presentation of intellectual lineage. I tend to think it probably has more to do with problems of translation and machination of political groups and academic claims for academic power, making the long march through the universities, as we say, then people like to let on. I don't know that it's possible really to distill to a purely theoretical debate, in part because in fact what Fortunati says is that that reproductive labor appears or presents itself as not producing value, right? But in fact, creates the only condition in which value can be produced, and you can then therefore subject it to, I mean, she's not even necessarily saying it's properly Marxist, because many of the Apparisti even they call themselves Marxian. They don't necessarily say that this is proper orthodox Marxism. They're saying that it's necessary as a theoretical and political venture, right? And that it is decidedly biased even. I mean, for Christ's sake, Tronti will say you have to write from the perspective of the hatred of capitalism. The book itself is this weapon stolen from the boss's arsenals. It's inherently evil, and that's part of this claim. The claim for wages for housework is it's not a good thing. There's what I think is kind of a specious argument that's made that the wages for housework people were making a moralistic argument, and maybe some of them were. I mean, to claim that, and they'll say, well, it's a moralistic argument, i.e., it's not a properly Marxist and rigorously theoretical argument. I think making that claim is a moralizing claim in itself, but let's step beyond that, right? It's saying, you're not a proper theorist, so you're sabotaging the revolutionary project, is its implication.
I think
Yeah.
one of the insights in Fortunati's work is how the wage
Right.
conceals capital's relationship to women by routing it through men. Whereas
Absolutely. Yeah.
Dalla Costa emphasizes how wage organizes social life, even where there is no
Mm-hmm.
compensation, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the frameworks kind of help us rethink wage not as a
Yeah.
reward. What are your thoughts on that? But as a sort of disciplining
Wage,
mechanism.
absolutely. And, I guess I would point out that, the Arcana of Reproduction, or the Arcana of Reproduction, is Fortunati's attempt at like distillation and operating at a very high level of abstraction. And it's this sort of feminist variation on an operaist Marxian themes. It does get fleshed out, I think, in terms of social relations and history in other works that are written at the same time and, published in the context of a movement, right? So
Yeah.
I think she would certainly agree, like that the wage is fundamentally a disciplinary mechanism, as she makes clear in Bruto Ciao, that work with Mariarosa Dalla Costa, right? And in fact, the wage is what gives the husband this kind of dual position where they are both subjected and both done to, and the doers, right? Creates some kind of cis masculine subject, right, that wants to be utterly degraded and subservient and obedient, yet domineering and entitled, right? And I would also say that Fortunati does make it very clear that this division, right? If you actually read the Arcana of Reproduction, and I don't expect everyone to read it this closely, but I translated it or co-translated it with a wonderful collaborator, Sara Colantuono, who knows a whole lot more about Italian histories of feminism than I do in different traditions. But she makes it clear that this division between production and reproduction is one that happens to the subject in general, right? The subject as a kind of negative universal, of capitalism, right? It happens to, in other words, it happens to men, put in, very plain kind of cisgendered language, right? And they are not like subject to it nearly in the same kind of oppressive and mystifying fashion that women are, but it still happens to them. In other words, they, are no longer reproduced, or they don't reproduce themselves, as subjects who are part of a community who trade and interact and have their place in whatever, socio-symbolic exists. They are free, quote unquote, as labor power that must be sold. And then they do something else, that reproduces themselves. So I would say this holds true even, for like the most despicable, like manosphere character or something who just, sits behind his computer ordering takeout all day, and then masturbating and talking about how women hate him, right? They are still reproducing themselves, right, as labor power that must be paid somehow, even if they're unemployed, and even if that is then mediated by their parents or by government subsidies or whatever, right? You know, and maybe thanks to a whole history of struggles, they are not expendable. They're not like yet immediately just cast out to beg and pick rags like they may have been in the in the kind of classic period of so-called primitive accumulation, but they are still paid by something, right? Yeah, and they're still subject to this division between production and reproduction, right?
What's interesting about Federici is she approaches these questions not through value, but through accumulation. And
Mm.
she argues that capitalism emerges through reproductive violence. And she does that through a historical analysis of witch hunts, land dispossession, and colonialism, in a way reframing Marxist periodization.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that? And could you elaborate on that difference maybe from what you've read?
Yeah. Well, so one of the texts that I've really enjoyed translating recently has been the original collaborative work between Fortunati and Federici, Il Grande Calibano. I can maybe hold it up here, but which they wrote together throughout the late 80s. I'm sorry, throughout the late 70s. It wasn't published until 83. But even there, I think you do sort of see their difference in approach, right? Like the two chapters that Silvia authors solo are these wonderful chapters: Il Grande Calibano, La lotta contro il corpo ribelle, the Great Caliban, the struggle against the rebel body, and La caccia alle streghe, the witch hunt, right? Which appear after much development and reworking and revision in Caliban and the Witch, right? When that is published, not until actually the late 90s, in a small edition, and then larger edition early 2000s, I believe, by a ton of media. And those are wonderful. Those are incredible chapters that she works and reworks. And she also has this experience, this added experience of going to Nigeria, right? She and George go and they get these teaching positions in Nigeria. And yeah, I mean, sub-Saharan Africa had some of the best, like, best institutions of higher education at the time. I mean, and some of the most flourishing Marxian traditions. I mean, the Dar es Salaam University, where Wamba Diawamba was teaching, and all the school, the institutions throughout Nigeria were great. They've kept up with many colleagues. But then there is this like dramatic restructuring of loans with the Volcker shock in '79 and the euphemistically called structural adjustment in the early 80s, where public institutions are defunded and privatized, and most brutally, student protests are brutally repressed. Democratic movements are often brutally repressed. So she sees this, and the whole Circle of Midnight Notes, I think, which is the collective that she and George are part of it, at the time, which also includes people like Peter Linebaugh, Monty McNeil, etc. Right? They see this as the new enclosures, right? As a new round of primitive accumulation. And Fortunati's contributions to the work. Well, I mean, she obviously they both collaborate and share work, and or in some ways, I think collaborating throughout. Her two solo author chapters are there's this incredible chapter on the use value of sex, right? Of sexuality, basically, which is almost a book unto itself, and is just about this transition to capitalism, not necessarily as having like a dramatic event that can be placed historically, but having this whole entire process of repositioning, re-educating, reformulating the guidelines for sexuality. The ways it's different from a Foucauldian historiography are quite interesting. I think it's actually somewhat closer to a psychoanalytic history, but that's a longer story. But there's I mean they're just fascinating, and I would point out that like l'arcano della riproduzione. Right, the term l'arcano is actually in Italian. If you were reading it in Italian, it would very clearly reference the mystery of primitive accumulation. So Marx uses Geheimnis der ursprüngliche accumulation, right? The mystery of originary accumulation. The English translation is notoriously terrible. And I think, thankfully they have finally revised it in this new Penguin edition of Marx Volume 1. But, because primitive has such terrible connotations of stagist, of a 19th century racist historiography of all of these, things. Marx actually uses the term ursprünglich, which is more like a Hegelian notion of origins out of nothing, right? And in fact, it's his most like mythopoetic and, kind of like it's almost like horror comedy, not in the trivial, popular culture way we think of it today. There are all these like terrible kitsch horror comedies out there. But everything is dripping with fire and blood. I mean, what is masked by the myth of the Robinsonade of Robinson Crusoe out, with his good friend Friday, is in fact the most horrific violence and colonization and slavery, etc. Right. So he's using the Hegelian term ursprünglich, I think, in a parodic fashion, actually, and that's just not always recognized in the history of Marx. So I mean, I would say that they actually complement each other, maybe Federici and Fortunati's use of the term, because indeed, it's real historical trauma. It's also a terrible kind of ongoing structure and repetition that's kind of inherent to capitalist development. It always needs some site to like decommodify and profit from, and that could be war, that could be exciting new technologies that derive value from mapping our faces while we have a discussion today and detecting our moods and then advertising to us, right? I mean, there can always be some new site, not to trivialize or flatten the difference between what's happening in Palestine, say, and and targeted marketing, right? Because of course there is all the world of difference, and that's in fact what's so pernicious about it, is it so normalizes violence that it can normalize cultures and peoples.
In Fortunati's cybernetic framing, she treats the household as a system of recursive sort of loops, right? Command, feedback, breakdown. Whereas like Dalla Costa's social factory thesis draws the household into sort of a different terrain of production, into the terrain of production, I should say. When we look at the picture of domestic labor that emerges during this time period, what is your understanding of how it's understood?
Right. Well, I actually, I think you can make an interesting kind of historically specific argument about that. Right, that has to do with Italy and has to do with the fact that like in many of with the new mass worker, right, which is what precedes the social worker or the operaio sociale. There is there's still a piecework system, right, that's really brutalizing and grinding. And if you read like Nanni Balestrini's Vogliamo Tutto or something that describes this migratory workforce, the immigrant workforce, working in the great industrial citadels of the north, they will literally bring home all the engine parts and freaking the entire family we'll assemble it on the table, right? And there's a lot. And then there's also, because most people come from agrarian backgrounds, there's also small scale farming and kind of like cottage production, right? I mean, there's sort of overlapping modes of production. It's like, I think women literally are, even if they're not formally employed, and even if their relation to capital isn't directly mediated by the wage, they're selling things, they're making things, they're doing things in the house, right? But then, yes, you can certainly track that. Well, and if they're living in Mestre, for example, where Dalla Costa is doing her original research, and their husbands are literally being poisoned by petrochemicals and they're coming home covered in this stuff, then the house is the site of production, right? I mean, there's a very like literal way in which to try to make a break between the public and private is, absurd. And you don't even need the kind of, brilliant like interventions of like U.S. feminism at the time, which break down the personal and political. There's something a little, well, yeah. I mean, you do still need that. I mean, that was an important part. They had a reception of the most radical elements of U.S. feminism, and those are all translated into Italian in the early '70s. But so
That's interesting.
I don't want to discount the internationalism. I mean, Maud Braca has an extremely good book. She may be the best, the most thoroughgoing historian in English, just of the internationalism of the Wages for Housework movement and of the different feminist movements in Italy in relation to international movements. But yeah, I mean, but then yes, as we chart Fortunati's work going forward, also, even before that, as to your question about cybernetics, it's really interesting because, Lotta Feminista is founded in 1971, and the Club of Rome's Limits of Growth comes out in 1972. Basically the same time. Just as this feminist movement is getting off the ground, there is this early application of a kind of cybernetic logic of feedback loops in analysis of so-called global sustainability, right? And of course, so they're always extraordinarily suspicious of logics of sustainability. And, the way that Dalla Costa herself has to come to a kind of feminist ecology sort of has to like pass over that in a really interesting way, because they recognize, and I think they're maybe getting this from Black feminism in the U.S., from the welfare rights movement in the U.S., and from maybe radical groups from Puerto Rico. But they're acutely aware of like the eugenics programs that are already underway in Puerto Rico and California in the post-war era. And under Indira Gandhi in India and the Green Revolution. And there's this real, so this application of like planning of reproduction and disciplining of reproduction by the state acting as a representative of global capital is very much a part of the early discourse. And so they'll say, the state needs us to have babies when it wants us to, right? Which we obviously see today in these ridiculous like neo-fascist pro-maternity initiatives that have been fairly global, right? I mean, they've been in Erdogan's Hungary, they've been in Putin's Russia, they've been in Trump's U.S. And elsewhere, of course. And then it wants us to be sterilized, or it wants us, to restrict our growth in the name of sustainability. Whenever it doesn't need a workforce, or whenever a workforce risks becoming too problematic, right? When American Blacks in the northern cities, a vanguard of agitation in workplaces and simply on a community level, they're all of a sudden a pariah and a menace, right, to the reproduction of the state. So they're very savvy about that kind of introduction of cybernetics or cybernetic logic. I mean, the mathematics and I think the limits of growth have been more roundly critiqued and turned out to be, largely quackish. And I'm not sure what they would say about the contemporary manifestations. Discourses of sustainability now, I think, have a different kind of political constitution, which is important to study. So it's not like they would wholesale dismiss any. But sorry, to answer the second part of your question, which was about Fortunati, because she does become a theorist she does become a theorist of media and media use. I think with the sort of Web 2.0 era when the internet is embodied or attached to the body, right? And circulates through the household in the form of durable commodities, automobiles, refrigerators, cell phones, etc. She does see this as a kind of expansion of reproductive labor and a more direct, in fact, extraction of value, from reproduction that wouldn't require mediation of the wage, because we have to work to check out our groceries. There's no more cashier. Certain labor is decommodified, right? We have to do our own banking online. We have to sign up for social services on the internet, right? There's all this work that is saved to industry and to the state. And then there's the extraction of value that comes through so-called data mining, which of course is not a term she would use, because there've been so many good popular and scholarly critiques of that term. We understand it as data production, or the production of a particular kind of commodity, which has carceral uses, which has commodity uses, which has population control uses, right? Yeah.
One thing I see in all three scholars' works,
Mm.
like Federici, Fortunati,
Mm-hmm.
and them, is all three reject essentialist ideas of what a woman is. And instead, they theorize reproductive subjects through their role, relation, and struggle. And what does that approach towards reproduction as a process of political composition mean in the broader context of this movement and their contribution to radical thought?
Yeah, well, I mean, I tend to think there still really is, something quite valuable in exploring, the particular legacies and articulations of this sort of operaist feminism. That can, I say operaist because I think you can also find that kind of core of co-research and potential struggle, right, rooted in operaismo to a certain degree. There's a wonderful new book that's just been translated into English by Gigi Rogero, which talks a lot about what co-research really meant in the in Alquati, in Montaldi, in the early radical sociology. And he actually does a lot of work with a wonderful feminist scholar, Anna Curcio, who sort of continues, I think, this practice in her own research into organizing in warehouses, organizing within the networks, the expanded and you could say cybernetically administered networks of global capital. But I think what I wanted to say specifically here was that, yes, there's of course not an essentialist conception of women or femininity. And there's a I think there's a really interesting play, right, between the practical and the utopian plane in terms of demands. I think that's what always sort of frustrates people still to this day about a demand like wages for housework, and people get all angry by it, because they don't know what it means. Does it just mean a better welfare state? Does it mean the absolute abolition of the wage? And there is this great operaist tradition, I think, which becomes even better in its feminist articulation, where the political as a kind of semi-autonomous realm has to precisely mediate this problem. So I don't know, I don't know that it's a utopian claim. I don't know that it is a reformist claim. I know that it's a provocative one, right? And sometimes they would refuse to answer the question, well, what do you mean? How do you actually realize wages for housework? They would say, well, if we have the capacity to build this demand, then we have the capacity to transform everything, right? Which is a good answer, kind of a cop-out, right? Other times they would make more, they would make more concrete proposals. They would say, we're going to protect the family allowance in England. We're going to counter the destruction of the welfare state in the U.S. We're going to, fight for a whole variety of causes that might resonate with this kind of reclamation of reproduction as a site of resistance. It's also about not proposing a positive figure, right? And that has to do with what I think you're touching on in the anti-essentialism, right? Because to say we are all house workers, you can understand how at the time that was sort of hard for a lot of the feminist movement to get behind because, in Betty Friedan's say, housework is precisely the frustrating, endless tedium that one wants to escape and, therefore should be eschewed at all costs. And, to say that you're organizing, as a housewife and that you still in some fashion do housework regardless of your sort of visibility, your prestige visibility, your other accomplishments is and perhaps be felt as demeaning, understandably, right? But still it's maybe what's necessary, right, is to not have a kind of positive political figure because we know how like wretched and violent those can be, and that's precisely what some of what the both Aparismo and then Lotta Femminista are rebelling against. Jacopo Gallimberti has a good book about the artworks of it touches on some of the artworks made by Lotta Femminista, but he points out there are these representations of maternity that are very prevalent in the Communist Party that look pretty much like the fascist representations of maternity for all intents and purposes. I mean, it's a kind of consistent socialist realism. I mean, I think the notion of like the perfect revolutionary subject or the perfect political subject that's worthy of our recognition and respect is obviously particularly pernicious today. I've been reading that wonderful book by what is his name? Mohammed El-Kurd, I think, the Perfect Victims. About how Palestinians have always been have been constantly demanded to be children, basically, to be children who are bombed without resistance, who are endlessly tolerant of violence, who have no sense of history of politics, who are pure innocents. Not that these are, equatable at all, right? These are very different political contexts and histories. But I do think that there's something about like needing a positive political figure that is always a defeatist and always sort of wraps you into a politics of recognition that risks reproducing capitalist relations, right?
Yeah. In terms of the wages discussion
Yeah.
and their work, love is treated kind of ambivalently. It's used to sort of, one could, some people, as you were mentioning before, kind of, this like, are they moralizing labor or obscuring dependencies? I know that Federici later claimed that it was something that we had to redefine or rework, in a radical sense. What tensions do you see in how they approach the politics of love?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. There's a great text by actually Mariarosa Dalla Costa's sister, Giovanna Franca Dalla Costa, called The Labors of Love, that I think was translated by Enda Brophy, if I remember, who's actually this wonderful media theorist, who at least early on in his career wrote a lot about wages for housework, and I think was influenced by autonomous feminism and Fortunati's work. So I would say, yeah, there is really, from the earliest text, there's this kind of like negative dialectic between compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory work, right? If you remember, there's this great line in Federici's Wages Against Housework where she writes, like, we must call work what is work. And she's describing why sexuality itself can become work, right? And, she says, we must call work what is work, so we might discover love which we have never known, right? So
I'm going to write that down.
yeah. It's a beautiful line. I think I'm paraphrasing it. I'm probably not quoting it precisely, but I can send you the quote. And Kathy Weeks actually takes this up, I think, in her book that really did a lot to rediscover the wages for housework movement as a kind of road not taken, your horizon of second wave feminism, if you use the wave system. The problem with work. But she says, Marxism has often been accused of being an essentialism of work. And, this accusation was made especially intensively against this movement, right? Because how can sexuality itself be work, right? But of course, the thing is, of course it can be work, right? We all know it can be work, and it has been since time immemorial, right? In the form of sex work. I mean, there's great literature on sex work early on in the movement, and many of the movement members actually, some practiced sex work, both in the Italian and British branches of the movement. So there's some real insight and analysis there. All I was going to say is, I would defend the sort of essentialism of work that runs through some Marxian traditions, right? I mean, because great methodologies often have a need to have a certain vulgarity in their claims. Be effective, right? I mean, if psychoanalysis says anything can be sexy, which is unfortunately true of the human, right? I mean, I think this is one powerful insight, right? Is that based on the role of sexuality and gender conditioning in the subject's development, because it sort of happens too early and too late and out of time, anything can be sexualized. Then anything can also be work, right? And you do see that, even love, even things done, really out of love and care and concern. There's this wonderful new book. I don't know if you've seen Pramila Dawson's new book called Care, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. It has a funny sort of joke Leninist title, but she writes about the way a care economy has sort of blossomed along with war economies, carceral economies, and wild speculation on AI. It's the only thing that's like actually keeping the capitalist class happy in their accumulation, right? Is investing in pharmaceuticals and an aging population, and deriving direct value from illness. And I mean, yeah, you see this. It's horribly in the new Trump legislation in the U.S., right, where they've defunded Medicaid, and funded ICE, right? It's a kind of healthcare fascism, but through denial of care and turning care into a profit-based industry. I think that element, right, that care work for the work of sexuality. And I'm not being very precise here. I mean, you could, there are actually people who write about the relation between Marxism and psychoanalysis, so I think would do this much more precisely. Talking about the way that work can be seen to operate between the two methodologies. I'm thinking of Samo Tomsik, but there are others. Sorry, that's sort of an aside. That's something that really interests me, though. I do think the current state of the economy is, and the cultures of neo-fascism, economies of neo-fascism, really make that connection clear. The connection between caring work and exploitation and sexuality, right? Also, if you just think about it on what one of the bad old Marxists, right, would have called superstructural level, right? If you think about like the intense both misogyny and transphobia of Trump's discourse, or of a MAGA discourse, right? I mean, the kind of manosphere podcast culture that wants to have both complete control over women's bodies, but then the idea that there would be any deviation in the sexuality or in gendered identification is absolutely unpalatable. Trans people must be banned from gender affirming care, from participation in society, essentially. I mean, honestly, it's a kind of phobia that that amounts to an erasure in the true sense. Like, they're just not supposed to exist, right?
Yeah.
It's really horrifying. Yeah. So there you
So
see, I think, an economy of
I
sex
want to
and.
shift gears for a bit,
Oh,
and I want to discuss groups like Black Women for Wages, for
yeah.
Housework, and Wages Due to Lesbians,
Mm-hmm.
who
Mm-hmm.
developed their own analysis on the question of reproduction, and how did
Mm-hmm.
their interventions reshape, the theories that these thinkers were bringing to the fore?
Yeah. Well, so it might be worth actually going back. So these are like semi-autonomous groups or, autonomous groups that form, under the umbrella of the Wages for Housework group. And they primarily form in like New York, Toronto, Philadelphia, London, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. But here I think what's really interesting, right, is that autonomy itself, or um, self-valorization, right, is a term that the Aparisti originally kind of, or Tronti very famously, like borrows from Marx's description of the way that capital works, right? So that, for example, when living labor presents itself on the factory floor, it appears as the self-valorization of capital. Um, you know, and I think that's like chapter 22 or so. It's sort of paraphrased all throughout A Factory in Society, and where the part of chapter from Workers and Capital. So originally it's a concept of what can be stolen away from the operations of capital, like for the self valorization, autovalorizzazione. It's another one of those words that translates very poorly, right? Harry Cleaver himself, who's kind of the coins the term autonomous Marxism, makes this clear that he doesn't like the translation. But so it's what can be wrested away and potentially used as the self development of the proletariat. And when there's a feminist transformation of this in general, of course, it becomes not the factory that expands out into the territory, right? Not that the whole world becomes a factory from a center point, but the potential that life and work be organized from reproduction outward. There's a wonderful early text by Lotta Femminista called The Manifesto of Housewives in the Neighborhood, I think. That's just about this process, right? How to organize. Dalla Costa famously says, and it's even the draft of Potere Femminile, Power of Women, she says, fiat invents the factory first, and then it gives you a canteen or a school attached to the factory, right? And there's certainly certain visions of humane capitalism where Olivetti will make his typewriter a computer factory and then try to make it a semi-socialist utopia, right? But the trick is to do the opposite, right? To have social reproduction take the lead, and then production for accumulation become secondary to it. But then, of course, what this means, when it comes to colonized countries, colonized peoples, becomes incredibly different, because if the if the housewife, in the great industrial centers of Italy's north, or in London or in New York, has been, if their work has been made invisible and indirectly waged, through the husband's wage, well, in colonial contexts, not only has it maybe been indirectly waged or totally unwaged, or it's performed, in the case of indentured servitude and forms of enslavement, it's performed, reproductive labor is directly performed in the house. So it generally becomes a different set of histories and problems, and psychodynamics to think through and work through. And I mean, I think, to their credit, I don't know if it was totally successful, but they were always very good about trying to make space for these groups, and these groups insisted upon it, right? The two, Margaret Prescott and Wilmette Brown, who co-found Black Women for Wages for Housework, are incredible thinkers, theorists, and
Yeah.
Margaret Prescott, especially on wrote a lot about carceral capitalism before it was popular to do so. Like Roosevelt and Gilmore will actually cite her. Her work was unknown, I think, for a long time, and is getting better known, because hopefully I think there are more histories and treatments. But anyway, as was Wilmette Brown, is absolutely brilliant. There's a good new book I should mention by Emily Kalachi that's sort of intellectual histories of the members, that includes a chapter on Brown and Prescott, which are really able, and I know a couple people who are writing on them. But so I mean, it's just to say that it's what it means to valorize. Yes, what it means to self-valorize. in the context of struggling for autonomy in against racism in the U.S. Or in a colonial context, could be very different and doesn't have the same kind of binary, right, that's assumed between the workplace and the home. So that's, I think, what becomes, but it has a whole racialized hierarchy or a sexualized hierarchy in the case of queer and lesbian sexualities.
You've
Yeah.
returned to these texts, as a translator from a contemporary position. What
Mm.
questions do you ask when revisiting militant writing from a different historical moment?
Well, I've thought a lot about this, and it's a great question. I'm not sure I have a satisfying answer. There's some irony here, right? In that, it's theories of reproduction, and then of course one is engaged in the reproduction of knowledge. To some extent, the reproduction of radical political programs. That there is. I think maybe an understandable but at times unfortunate tendency just to faithfully receive and reproduce, right? Which is of course a huge part of translators or archivists' work, but it can never be done successfully, right? Whether you want to or not. All translation is mistranslation, as they say, to some degree, and requires contextual reframing, a reinvention to some degree. There is no right, like messianic truth that's going to be discovered in the archive.
Yeah.
Right. This is what Derrida says. The archive is always has a messianic hope, but yeah, there's not going to be a complete political program, right? A perfect complete political
And
program discovered in the archive, and I think it's very unfortunate when people try to do that. There has to be a reflection and engagement, of course, based on changing, changing politics and social political situation.
what editorial or archival projects are you currently working on that you'd like to share? And
Yeah, no, I'm actually.
or if you have any upcoming work that's being published or anything of that.
Yeah, no, I'm doing quite a bit. I'm working actually on an essay for Italian Studies Journal with Maya Gonzalez about some of these early archival documents and about the reception of Lotta Femminista and the relationship with current theories of reproduction and value theory. So this would actually very much touch on one of the questions that you asked earlier, about these whole debates regarding the indirect or direct production of value in what we would call reproductive work or reproductive labor as kind of capacious categories, maybe too capacious sometimes, right? Then there is also I'm working on a piece on gender and money with Leopoldina Fortunati, which is very exciting. I'm translating some of the untranslated chapters of Il Grande Calibano for a publication of those, and I'm at
That's
work on
excellent.
which is a wonderful because it really there's such rich historiography in that book. Though it's certainly less polished in ways than Caliban and the Witch, it also, I think, has incredibly powerful reflections on history, accumulation, the transition problem, as it were, right, which are somewhat perennial. And it's much more situated in the Italian context, right? The whole introduction contains sort of direct and indirect arguments with Negri and Tronti about the question of transition, both transition from feudalism, right, but to also the what comes after. And you have to admit that everyone is writing these beautiful things in the early 80s, in a kind of state of despair because the left has been in Italy has been dispersed and imprisoned, and capitalist flight and what's euphemistically called globalization or neoliberalism are in full swing. So it's a very interesting time for Marxian and kind of radical left historiography, I think. So that's fun. I'm also working on a project with minor compositions on a translation, an interview, and little essay introducing the final issue of Operaia della Casa, which was the journal of Lotta Femminista. They published this wonderful issue called Mille fiori spocciano appassiti. It means 1,000 withered flowers bloom. Roughly, it's like a parody of the Maoist slogan. Because there's this proliferation of literature that comes out of autonomous groups in the movements of 77 that is just fascinating, and they have a whole invested critique of it that's quite interesting, and he touches on what I'm trying to write about is actually the concept of need, right, and radical need, which is sort of theorized intensively at the time by both the Aparisti, the autonomists, the those who are more influenced by psychoanalysis, the distinction between desire and instinct, or right,
Thank you.
besoin and desire. So yeah, it's quite interesting. Oh, if I could just promote one more thing, and I don't know if it will even be up by the time this gets produced and released, but I am working on a website. Because I translated a sort of insane number of documents just for practice and when I was learning Italian. A lot from the Dalla Costa archives, but also from an array of journals. And I'm trying to collect other interviews and traditions as well. And I managed to get the domain name infantiledisorder.com, which I can't believe nobody had claimed yet. So that should be up and have a lot of translation that's in process and variously framed, but should be very interesting because so many of those documents, so much of that literature remains unknown, because it was produced in small editions for circulation.
Thank you, Arlen, for this sharp and uncompromising conversation on the political force of reproductive labor, the militant legacy of Fortunati, Dalla Costa, and Federici, and the unfinished work of theory as struggle. If this resonated, unsettled, or clarified something for you, share it, spread it, and if you're able, support the work at buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Until next time, stay with the struggle.